Thank you, Robin, for asking me and inviting me to moderate this session. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first plenary session of the 2021 edition of the NCCR On the Move Graduate Conference. As is often the case at the beginning of a crisis, the COVID outbreak saw the proliferation of more or less dystopian and grim prophecies about what came to be referred to in the media as the day after the pandemic. Today, we invited two prominent social scientists specialized in migration and mobility studies to tell us about the day after the day after. The question we ask is, what is the future of mobility and immobility as those wealthy portions of the world that could afford and could deploy vast vaccination campaigns arguably are seeing the end of the COVID tunnel? Because academics are neither oracles nor fortune tellers, they are often reluctant to talk about the future. Yet, their task is also, to paraphrase French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, to invent a future for and out of the past. So whether their probabilistic scenarios based on their expertise actually materialize or not is a secondary question. What matters is that they provide the public with a conceptual map to navigate the contingencies of the present, to avoid the icebergs along the journey, and to steer the boat of governments and decision makers in a desirable direction. This is no easy task, and I'd like to thank our two guests today for taking up the challenge. But before I pass the floor to them, I would like to briefly introduce the topic and raise a few questions that may or may not be relevant for our purposes. Let me start with what we at the NCCR are very much concerned with. That is the conceptual distinction between migration and mobility. While the precise definitional contours of both terms are contested, most would agree that migration is a narrower concept, which essentially refers to human movements across international borders for more or less extensive periods of time. By contrast, mobility is far more ubiquitous. It encompasses all types of movements, from a bike ride to the office to the peregrinations of a West African refugee fleeing his homeland and trying to reach the shores of Europe. And if we endorse this view in this light, then the COVID crisis has been rather a crisis of mobility than a crisis of international migration. On the one hand, the need to curb the spread of the virus condemned billions of people to the solitary confines of their own homes. On the other hand, the immobility that was imposed upon non-essential workers, and perhaps even people doing bullshit jobs, contrasts sharply with the continued migration of so-called essential workers on the front line, such as nurses, agricultural workers, and employees in essential shops, that is, professions where international migrants are overrepresented. Accordingly, international borders were not so much sealed as they were selectively open to ensure systemic stability. But notwithstanding the fundamental contribution of immigrants in mitigating the consequences of the measures that were meant to address the crisis, the pandemic has predominantly been interpreted as prompting the need to return to the local after 2 decades of unleashed globalization. Interestingly, the rise of localism cuts across ideological cleavages, and this is very much an idea which is half-baked, but that I borrowed from a recent text by Tim Cresswell, which I encourage everyone to read on COVID and mobility. So what we have that localism, and it's basically a very broad consensus of strange bedfellows. On the conservative end of the political spectrum, it gave credence to new right ideologues who have long advocated returning to the local community as the ultimate remedy to the evils of modernity. We also have pro-market conservatives that saw the rapid digitalization of the economy as the best way to square the so-called liberal paradox, that is the tension between the economic need for foreign workers and the native backlash against immigration. But we also have a pro-local tendency among the left. And of course, we have ecologists that have interpreted the fragility of international supply chains as the opportunity to revitalize local markets in response to global warming. And we also have more social, rather social democratic leaning politicians that will rediscover the territorial dimension of economic inequalities. So there, really, it's pushing towards the local, but we have other evidence that points in the exact opposite direction, away from the local and towards globalism. Let me just provide you with a few examples. Populist strongmen from Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil to Donald Trump in the US lost much of their appeal in the wake of their catastrophic management of the crisis. The quest for a vaccine has been a truly global scientific effort and fairly successful, as a matter of fact. And post-lockdown economic growth, at least in those countries that are at that stage, far exceeds the most optimistic expectations in Europe and North America. According to The Economist, the world is about to experience its second roaring 20s, characterized by rapid economic growth, free trade, digital innovation, and, so they say, open borders. So how could the political mood shift so rapidly? How can we make sense of such contradictory evidence? Who will choose to move or choose to stay still? And conversely, who will be forced to move or forced to stay still? Are some of the questions that some of you in the audience and all speakers as well may or may not decide to address in this session. So after this very brief and perhaps confusing introduction, let me introduce our two speakers. We have first Nicolas Sander, who is currently the research director for migration and mobility at Germany's Federal Institute for Population Research. She is a population geographer whose research focuses on quantifying, understanding, and visualizing past, present, and future migration patterns. She has authored over 30 articles that were featured in many prestigious journals, including Science. Tim Cresswell is also a human geographer as well as a poet. He is the, and pardon my French here, the Ogilvy, that I'm not sure that's how it's supposed to be pronounced, but he's the Ogilvy Professor of Human Geography at the University of Edinburgh, and one of the main protagonists of the mobility turn in the social sciences in the 2000s. Though sharing the same discipline, they are the heirs of different traditions, quantitative and positive for the former, qualitative and interpretive for the latter. But we at the NCCR are methodological pluralists and fervent believers that epistemological diversity is the optimal path to approximate the truth. So the session is organized as follows. First, our two guests will share their vision of the future with us for about 10 minutes for each of them. It will be followed by a short discussion between them before we open the floor to the audience. So you may ask your questions either by raising your hand and speaking up or by writing it in the chat. The NCCR graduate conference usually is a great in-person event, and we are deeply saddened that we could not have you with us this year. While waiting for the return of normalcy, which I still like to consider as face-to-face interactions involving flesh, bones, sweat, laughters, and sometimes tears, and even blood, you are warmly encouraged to engage and participate in what is rather meant to be a bottom-up dialogue with the audience than a top-down lecture to the audience. So apologies for this rather long introduction, and Nicolas, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Thomas, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this, what promises to be a very interesting dialogue. First, try to share the slides again. Okay, so hopefully you now see a full screen slide and hear me correctly. Just to check that. Okay, great. So in the 10 minutes that I have here, I want to touch on two aspects that I think are especially relevant when we think about the future of mobility and immobility. And the first one touches on the three aspects that are closely tied together here, which is COVID-19, home office, and the future of cities. And I talk here about both internal migration and international migration at the same time. Cities are an ideal place to actually start this because they both serve as hubs for international migration when we think about this discussion of arrival cities, but they also serve as hubs for internal migration when we think about the global turn towards urbanization, when we think about the location of innovation, of exchange, of everything that the cities are made of, and that was so under stress during COVID-19. So when the lockdown hit, a lot of things that made cities attractive as places to live in became actually very unattractive. Shopping, culture, everything that makes density interesting, interaction, everything was basically locked down. So what we saw was this trend towards home office, towards working from home, remote work, not really being together anymore. And what we saw was the decline of the attractiveness of a city turning into this out-migration into the hinterlands. When people realized I can work from home more, there's now the trend that companies are actually selling office space in the cities, saying even post-COVID, they will make more home office available. And people vote with their feet and say, well, during the pandemic, I've missed my garden, I've missed space to be outside. And I now have a desire to live in a place that is greener, that has its own garden, where kids can grow up. And so they vote with their feet. We have more or less only anecdotal evidence so far, but we've seen an increase of this trend towards suburbanization. So people moving from the cities to the hinterlands, especially families, which has already started in many Western countries in the last years, partly because living in the cities and in big cities has become so expensive with rents skyrocketing. So we've seen this out-migration to the hinterlands, and anecdotal evidence suggests, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it, that COVID and the lockdown has increased that trend and actually accelerated it. So people move out, they have less to commute, less often to the city, the places to work. And the question is now what that means for the future. So internal migration might be trending towards more city to hinterland migration. There might actually be an increase in that type of move over the next couple of years. Basically a return to what we've seen in some countries in the 90s, but definitely something that is a change in trends. And at the same time, we might also see there's less commuting. So here's the link to Tim Cresswell and his side of things. And that there's actually this disconnect between the city as a place of work and the city as a place of living. If people are free to choose where they want to live because they don't have to commute to the city to work, I mean, for the future of work and the future of cities that have seen innovation, that have sort of lived on this idea of density, people coming together to be creative, to produce new ideas. Can this actually be done via Zoom? You might argue, no, it can't. How can we then come together and create ideas in this new era of working from home? I think this is an issue that really we have to still work out how this actually turns out post-COVID. But it certainly has an impact on the cities. The question is, will empty office space be successfully converted into affordable homes, which might make cities more attractive again for people to actually live in? But that is also up to policy to actually monitor this. And then at the same time, we can certainly say the future of cities in the context of COVID is less certain than it has been in say 5 years ago. So the second point I want to make, can you still see the slides? Yeah.
No, you should upload the slide again, actually. We can't, I mean, I cannot see it on my computer. I guess it's...
See it, yeah. I've accidentally pushed some button and that suddenly changed things.
No problem. Take your time.
Okay, can you now see the second slide? Okay, great. So the second point I want to make pertains very much to the quantitative side that Jean-Thomas touched on before. I'm definitely a quantitative scientist looking at migration, trying to estimate global international migration flows. That's basically what I've been working on a couple of years ago, very intensively, to fill a huge data gap that will also continue to shape migration research in the future, as I may argue. Because there is simply no official database that tells us how many people move between countries every year. There's just not. We know how many people live in countries that they are not born in, so the stock of migrants, we probably have a relatively good idea, but the flow of people, global migration flows, the data remains very sketchy. So we've turned to estimations, estimating flows from stocks, for example, what the image in the middle illustrates. And now more recently, we've also turned to new data sources that have emerged from social media, for example, Twitter and Facebook, mobile phone data, even consumer data, a lot of private company data that is now turned into research purposes, with all the pros and cons that it comes with. So it provides almost terabytes of data, but it has its hinges. So there is huge debate about the ethical issues of using social media data. There are issues that companies do not disclose their algorithms, how they actually extract data that is used by migration scholars or data scientists to impose migration. They're actually not always disclosing the algorithms or how they're actually extracting these data. So the problem here is, I think, with using social media and other new data sources, is that we don't really know what they actually measure. And we don't really know what kind of moves they actually count, what is counted, what is not. So we'll really have to work on in the future to better understand what is measured with new data sources in terms of moves, in terms of migrants and migrations. We had this discussion about traditional data sources where we now think about, okay, there are transitions and there are events, and there's 5-year census data, and there's 1-year data from population registers, and we try to harmonize that. But there's a whole new world now that opens up with social media data that we hardly touched on, I would say. So we need more collaborations perhaps between data scientists and migration scholars to actually disentangle that. And I like to see a better integration of different data sources to actually try and estimate migration flows and produce more robust and more reliable data in the future. Because this is really holding quantitative research on migration back, is the lack of adequate data. But as much artificial intelligence as we might throw at data, and as much as we might try to estimate it, I would argue that it's almost certainly true that we'll never find the true number of migrants that we have around the globe. So with that, I want to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I think we'll move straight to Tim, and then get back to your view as to what our collective future might be. But not only for the migrants, but also as social scientists studying migration, as I understood in the second part of the talk, which is certainly relevant for our audience.
Can you see the screen? Yeah, good. Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me. It's pleasant to come back to Neuchâtel, even though I'm not there. My 6 months I spent there a while ago was a very important time in development of my work, and I'm looking forward to coming back again sometime soon. So this discussion is obviously fundamentally important, and it's never been more obviously important than now. we are in the middle of a crisis that certainly the better off part of the world, the more developed nations in the world, haven't really experienced anything like it for about 100 years of a global pandemic that is changing the way that we interact with each other. And I was teaching a mobilities course to undergraduates when this all broke. And it was almost as though everything I was talking about was being demonstrated day by day as we were going through the semester, talking about mobility and power. What I'd like to do here is briefly link some themes about the future of mobility that all have to be connected and are sometimes thought of separately, but need to be related to each other. And they do, I think, link nicely to what Nikola was just talking about. So the first is the obvious, well, it isn't the first on this screen, but the global pandemic we're in. There will be more of them. They're both partly caused by mobility and connectivity, and then the solution to them is seems to be about the ways that we control, monitor, police mobility of one kind or another, and immobility. But of course, this global pandemic exists within a larger crisis, the climate emergency, and the need for mobility transitions in the future, changes in the ways that we move, as the ways that we move increasingly become the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions in developed economies. In places like Switzerland, Germany, UK, and the US, the transport sector is already the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, as the energy sector has rapidly declined and industry has to some degree followed. I also want to talk a little bit about, again, connecting back to what Nikola was just saying, algorithmic mobilities, the ways in which algorithms have been involved in how we move, when we move, who knows where we're moving, and what happens to us when we move is very important. And the kind of wider sense of what we might call, or what Mimi Scheller has called, mobility justice. In all of this, we need to think about what it means to be just in relation to mobility. So these are the four themes that are going to circulate through the remainder of my comments. So theoretically, I wanted to sort of go through some very broad outlines of ways I think about mobility and what that means for my thinking about future mobilities. So all the four themes that I just discussed involve simultaneous transformations in three things that are aspects of mobility. One of them is movements, and by that I simply mean that which is measurable, mappable, calculable, countable, even given the complications with counting that we just heard about. Movements are things that you can represent through, flow charts, spreadsheets, maps, as such, and you can simply say how much is moving, how many people are moving, how often are they moving, how fast are they moving, what direction are they moving in. All of these aspects of movement that are shared by the smallest movements of an individual body to the largest scales of mobility across the world. Meanings, meaning if mobility is different from movement, the main way it's different is that mobility, we have to think of it as a social and cultural phenomena that has meaning attached to it. It isn't just stuff that you can count, it's stuff that means things and is constantly made to mean things in the way that we talk about it. And practices, by which I simply mean, how do we or should we move? Like if you see a line on a map, it makes a big difference if that line on the map is someone's flight and they're flying in first class, or if it's someone who is traveling on an unseaworthy boat across the Mediterranean, for instance. The actual embodied experience of mobility is an important aspect of it. These combine, I argue, to produce constellations of mobility that at any given time, there are loosely formed structures of movement, meaning, and practice, from the large scale to the small scale. And here I want to follow Raymond Williams' discussion of culture to talk about different kinds of constellation, or different temporal dimensions of constellations of mobility. That is, there are residual constellations, constellations from the past that exist in the present and may continue to exist into the future. There are dominant constellations of movement, meaning, and practice. That is what we generally live in and what's around us, formed within the context in which we live in liberal democracies in the West, in most of our case here. and emergent constellations of movement, meaning, and practice. And these can be new configurations like arising out of COVID, and that Nicola was just discussing. And they could be progressive emergent constellations, or they could be regressive emergent constellations, or they could be a combination of both. And one of the things that's fascinated me during COVID is the degree to which the progressive side of the argument has generally and somewhat unproblematically or problematically gone along with emergent constellations of mobility that have quite oppressive and regressive implications if you take them out of the context of COVID. And I'll explain what I mean as I go forward here. So the present always carries elements of the past. We can talk about path dependencies, as sociologists do, or phase space, which is an ex-colleague of mine, Martin Jones, has spoken about, the way in which what exists now configures the future. Like the future is always configured in relation to what exists. So the past always carries forward into the future. Future emergent constellations will include residual and dominant movements, meanings, and practices within them. So they're always combined with each other. And new mobilities and immobilities, what we've been asked to speak about here, will always be as well partly old mobilities and immobilities. And I think that we have to think about what aspects of the old translate into the new. So that's basically just some of the conceptual framing that I think about when I think about future movements. So algorithmic mobilities. One of the things that's happened over the last 2 years is the multiplication of and, for the most part, acceptance of encoded measurements of our mobility in our devices, which includes within them algorithms that devise things like risk scores for catching COVID. So particularly with track and trace. So this is the expression in English, and I don't know if it's used that way in other languages, but track and trace is one of the main ways in which it has been argued that we can successfully confront COVID, that we know where people are, where they've been, and who they've been with, in order to see who's most likely to be infected, and therefore to limit their mobilities as a result of that, to induce quarantine or lockdown or other measures that limit mobilities. Now, if we go back to a pre-COVID era, and we imagined an argument being made for the universal uptake of something called track and trace, it's hard for us to imagine, I think, that everyone would say, yeah, that's a good idea, we'll do that. Even though some of that capacity is in our commercial apps and in Google Maps and in other ways in which we navigate the world. But I think that algorithmic mobilities that have become embedded in the way in which everyday life is being constructed, and it's something that that is linked to wider and older conceptions of mobility at different scales. So while track and trace appears to be a micro scale thing, in fact, measuring if you're within 2 meters of somebody who has COVID and being in their presence for more than 15 minutes, I think is the way the NHS app works for track and trace. Well, it doesn't work actually, because track and trace is dreadful in Britain, but in some places it works better. Those are the kind of parts of the algorithm that are inside there. And so we have to, and the future algorithms and the way they work with mobilities is part of our future, whether it's to do with COVID or not. And I think that COVID instructs us into thinking about the cautionary ways in which we engage with algorithms and the ways that we move around. The multiplication of bordering. So algorithms are linked to this idea of bordering within society. So what's happened very quickly within 2 years or 18 months is the high visibility of the bordering of the micro scale as we move around. So for instance, the use of QR codes to get into restaurants and to get out of restaurants and to get into bars and to get out of bars is an important part of opening up. So to open up, we have to introduce borders that become things we have to negotiate to cross. So the phrase opening up, which suggests a kind of increasing freedom, is based on this idea that we give something over, that we provide information as we use these QR codes, and as we will be using vaccine passports, both domestically and internationally, as we go through national borders as well. So there's an increased bordering of everyday life as we enter restaurants or pubs, have our co-presence monitored as we walk around the streets, and even in the safe space of the home. The relation between micro and macro configurations. So, so here a picture of a relatively empty Heathrow Airport, which most of us would dream about under normal circumstances if we were traveling through it, and a crowded pub, which is given as, or a bar, which is given often as an evidence of life coming back to normal. I don't know if every country is obsessed with drinking as Britain is, but every single time we go in and out of lockdown, it seems to be based on when can we go to the pub. Rather than all the other things that we do. So it's become an important site to think about our mobilities. And one of the things that's quite clear is the bottom picture here of the pub being busy is being increasingly linked to the top picture of a lockdown of international borders. So right now we're talking about traffic light systems and vaccine passports and who can come in and who can't come in. And in some cases, such as in New Zealand or Taiwan or other places, the lockdown at the national border has been extreme, so that the inside, the opening up can also be free. People can be freer to move around. So there's an argument that we're freer where we are if we have less interaction with the world outside us in particular ways. And of course, and as with these other things, people on the progressive side of academia and politics have basically been in favor, probably more in favor of these things than the right. The right has been the people arguing against lockdowns and arguing against even the closing of borders, when normally they are the people arguing for the closing of borders. And so there's this interesting flip going on. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is how the meanings that we normally associate with border closing can be continued post-COVID, once we become accepted it as part of the COVID rationale, that there's a link between, sort of anti-immigrant discourse, for instance, and COVID border discourse, which becomes clear here. So now this new and old bordering are being linked together. So as we have national border lockdowns due to COVID, we start to think about other reasons people might want to stop mobilities across national borders. COVID, we know, is linked primarily to connectivity. So very dense spaces, people can live in without getting too much COVID if they're not highly connected spaces. When it's a highly connected space, like a global city, then there's an increased potential for catching COVID, for the virus spreading. So this connectivity is also, of course, part of the language of regressive political and theoretical arguments. So the early connection of COVID to the stranger or foreigner, the Chinese virus, as Trump called it, and people in the Trump administration called it, or arguments that were made about refugees and asylum seekers being spreaders of COVID, which happened both at the US-Mexico border, but also in places like Hungary, where arguments would be maybe we can close our borders now, as we've always wanted to, because now it's obvious that it's the safe thing to do because of COVID, and refugees are going to bring them. So there's what's happening here is these new configurations are being informed by older, what you might call residual or dominant configurations of imaginaries of the nation state and of the local and of home, which are all being defended in particular ways by an interesting cross-section of political voices that you wouldn't normally expect, and without too much consideration of what that might mean in the future, in my view. So these are then connected themes. The themes I started with, I haven't mentioned much about the climate crisis, but there has been discussion how reductions in mobility because of commuting, because of air travel, have been linked to climate crisis. So one of the arguments that's made is, look, and I've made this argument, in fact, governments can do something if they want to. They certainly have with COVID. So if they treated the climate crisis with the same seriousness, then they could act in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as they did as a secondary product of the lockdowns due to COVID. The COVID crisis allowed us to imagine emergent constellations of mobility, as we've talked about, using active transport, so cycling and walking, daily walks, dramatically less air travel, down by as much as 90% almost immediately. More home working, all of these kinds of things seem to be a reconfiguration of our geographies into an emergent constellation of mobility, of movement, meaning, and practice that carries some of the old with it, but is also something that people have imagined could be part of a new normal that is a good thing. But also this, at the same time, this has reinforced dominant constellations of national borders, fear of the mobile other, division of those who get to move from those who can't move, and people who have to move. In other words, as we were told in the introduction, the workers who have to move in order to serve those people at home. So these old divisions are being remapped onto new geographies that are becoming very apparent to each other. And finally, the need to move for mobility justice. The need to work for mobility justice, which is Mimi Scheller's term, based on what both Mimi and myself and a number of collaborators in this book that's coming out in November have talked about as the mobility commons, about the way mobility can be disconnected from both individual freedom and economic growth, and instead thought of as a social good, where one person's movement is connected to other people's movements, and thinking about what is the relationships of justice or injustice between those in order to account for how we react to emergencies in the future. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. I didn't prepare any questions because I wanted to be spontaneous, and I find some common themes, but I'm not sure this will be very relevant. So we'll probably move on, and I probably pass the burden of asking clever questions to the audience. But I do see perhaps two or three things. One that you seem to have in common, but you approach it in very different ways, is the rise of big data, basically. And in Nicolas' view, big data is needed to better understand the phenomenon of international migration and be better able to measure it. In Tim's view, it seems to be, it has some good sides to it, I guess, the track and trace, which will limit the spread of the disease, but it also, there are a number of risks. And so I see three uses of the data. You have data collection for social science purposes or for public policy purposes. You have data exploitation by private companies. After all, I mean, I have a colleague who writes about the fact that we as data producers, we are workers and therefore should get a piece of the pie as a result of the fact that we produce the raw material in the first place. And then there is data manipulation by governments, right? So perhaps I'd like to hear both of you on what a future with so much data out there might mean. And perhaps a related question would be, what is the scope of your prophecy? It's not a prophecy, but what is the scope of your vision? It seems to be very, I mean, Nicola, what cities do you have in mind? In which countries do you think it will be a global phenomenon? And Tim as well. Is it very much, the British Isles? To what extent would that work on the continent? And I'm sure it does, but does it really work beyond? Right? In a world where actually 700 million people still do not have a birth certificate. So perhaps Nicola or Tim, whoever.
I'm happy to start. So it's a big topic, big data, that is tricky to squeeze into a quick discussion and a short answer. In general, I don't think it has to be used for migration studies. There's no essential need for it. We have quite good statistics from official sources. The UN has been working on harmonizing existing data and existing ways for capturing migration in censuses, and Eurostat has worked on harmonizing migration data from population registers in Europe. So I think there's quite a lot of data out there on international migration from sources that we sort of have learned to trust. So if the UN issues data, we sort of rely on, okay, there's an official international body here that issues these data, so they should be trustworthy. The same if Eurostat or a National Statistical Office does it. But I think we should be much less trustworthy when it comes to these new data sources where private companies are standing behind it with their own interests. And I think we need to learn how to, be cautious and deal with that caution, how to actually address it and work around it to make the data usable, but be cautious at the same time. Especially when it comes to advising policy, I think we should be really sure that the data we use are actually solid and robust, and actually we know what is measured. So I think here, my PhD advisor has always been very active in promoting that we need to know who collects what in international migration data and what can actually be compared, what is comparable, what is actually behind the data, even the ones that the UN and National Statistical Offices publish. And I think this is even more true for the new data sources. So there are new opportunities here. I'm not saying everyone has to use it. I think we can explore what is possible here, but should be proceeding with caution.
Yeah, I am by no means a big data expert. And I think there's a difference between big data as a kind of idea and algorithms, actually. So as I understand it, and Nicola can probably correct me if I'm wrong, when big data was kind of conceptualized, the idea was that big data would replace algorithms. That big data was a kind of, the data would be so big that it would explain itself, that it would not need manipulation in particular ways. It wouldn't need an algorithm behind it making particular kinds of judgments and sorting. I think of it as like Borges' famous poem about the map. I don't know if everyone knows it, like a little prose poem about the map, where he talks about the cartographers were asked to make a map by the king, and he wanted a map that was a scale of 1 to 1. So a map, they made a map as big as the empire itself. And of course it was useless because it was just the empire. I mean, when the map gets to that size, it's not doing any work. It's just reflecting what it's of. And I think that there's something about big data. The idea of big data, as it was conceptualized when it was first conceptualized, was really quite similar to that. It was a kind of, there will be so much data that it'll be reality, and the algorithm is something which is needed to sort, prioritize, make sense of something like that. So I think that in that sense, I'm slightly less concerned about big data as such, and more concerned about the algorithm and the algorithms that are being used to make decisions. One of the things that happened in early lockdown, in the first year of lockdown in the UK, was the assignment of grades to high school students, right, leaving high school because they couldn't do exams. And the first thing the government did is use an algorithm, and the algorithm basically said, how did kids at the school they're coming from do over the last 10 years? And then basically assign them grades as though they were the average of that 10 years of kids at that school, which meant it was almost impossible for a very talented child in a bad school to get A's. Whereas it's almost certain that almost any child in a good school would get A's. And there was outcry because everyone realized the injustice of this pretty quickly. And then the second way of doing it was to trust the teacher. The teacher knows the student, so the teacher can decide based on how they've known them over time what grade they will get, which of course has its own problems as well, because generally teachers want their students to do well, and there's all kinds of issues with that. But I think that my problem is more with the algorithm part than it is with I am kind of concerned about big data, but I can't articulate quite why. I am concerned about the kind of the idea that you mentioned of we're being mined for it, as we're almost like resources for profit generation. And I think that the split between corporations and government isn't that clear. I think they're all linked to each other. They certainly are in Britain. So, you know, so it isn't as though you can say, well, government's okay and corporations aren't, because I think government can be just as bad as corporations, or worse. In China, for instance, right? I mean, in China, the government is mapping people's movements through big data processes. So they will see when you are crossing a street illegally, and you will get points deducted from you, which means it makes it harder for you to get a mortgage or to get a worse rate. I mean, it's like watching Black Mirror, if any of you have watched it. I mean, they've got a sort of social point system, and part of that is tracking people and seeing that they're behaving themselves. And that's government, not corporations. Corporations are helping government because they have the know-how to do it. So, so I think that that the question about would it extend beyond Britain? Well, yes. I mean, China's the optimal place at the moment for the way in which the government works to use big data and algorithms to manage its population in a biopolitical kind of way.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask one last question, which is, Nicola, your take on the city, on the decline of the city, is indeed an argument that has been made out there, and it came together with the idea that this might be the revenge of the countryside, and that there is no more isomorphism between the place where people work and where people party and where they love and where they live, right? So I was wondering, for one thing, is there any way to quantify the phenomenon? Because, you know, the whole thing might actually be overblown. And what would that mean for the periphery? And perhaps by providing us with a concrete example, be it Germany, a federal state, or perhaps you had the US in mind. And same thing for you, just to have something a bit concrete to get the conversation started with the audience. I really like, and I might actually use, without citing you, the conceptual framework of movement, meanings, and practices, and then the mobility constellations, emergent. And so could you perhaps give us a very concrete example of what a dominant constellation might be? You know, I mean, you don't have to, we cannot quantify it for now, it's indeed into the future, but I was wondering what your take was on one the most likely dominant form of mobility. And then we'll pass the word to the audience.
So I start, is that right? So the decline of the city, as we call it today, I think actually started a couple of years ago, in some countries a bit earlier, in some countries a bit later. We've seen this in the US, but also in other countries, and I'll now refer mainly to Germany because here I have the clearest picture of the actual numbers. In Germany, we've seen a decline of the net migration gains of the largest cities through migration since 2017. So already in the last couple of years, the cities through migration internally have lost more population than they've gained. And that was mainly because the 30 to 49-year-olds and the under 17s, so families with young children, decided to move at higher rates from the cities to the countryside. Whereas previously they actually got stuck in the cities. So young adults moved for education, for jobs to the cities, and then the young families decided to stay in the city, to find a flat there and enjoy the culture and the interaction. And that actually brought about the huge discussions about skyrocketing rents that we saw in the late 2000s. So in Germany it was, and we did a quantitative model on this, it was actually really strongly increasing rents and housing prices that pushed people out of the cities. So this was mainly a push factor, slightly also a deterring factor of people not moving to the cities at such high rates. But it was mainly a housing issue that forced families to move out or urged them to move out. And so the thing actually started way before COVID came. And we now see that it might be amplifying the trend that we've seen before. So we're not seeing something totally new yet. We're just seeing some amplified existing trend that we've seen before. And that means at the moment, we're waiting for the data for Germany for the county level to be released in a couple of days, I think. And then we can actually look at what's happened in 2020, although we're thinking, of course, there's always a lack with migration, with the planning of a move, that we might only see the real effect in 2021. So we might still have to wait a little bit longer to really quantify how much it has amplified and the patterns of movement, whether they've changed. So far we've seen for 2020 that there's been a decline in migration at the longer distances by about 6%, so nothing huge, but still visible. It's partly also students that are not moving to university towns and staying home because of remote teaching. But what we're now wondering about is whether people will actually go not only to the hinterland of the cities, what we've seen was the dominant trend so far, but it will actually go beyond sort of that first hinterland ring of the larger cities and even move to more remote places that are beyond the commuting ranges of the larger metropolis areas. And you see some mixed pictures when you talk about that with politicians and with people actually in NGOs in the rural areas. Some say, okay, there is no demographic change with population aging, population decline. We might actually be able to address it if now we can attract people from the cities to actually move to our places. And then people in the rural areas, they're somewhat afraid of these foreigners, the others from the cities that are now coming to their places and introduce new scary things. So it's kind of interesting to see both views here and how it will emerge over the next coming years.
Thank you so much, actually, Nicola. We have, hopefully in a couple of years, in 1 year from now, we'll have a project on regional disparities, and we will very much get in touch with you because you seem to have great data, and I love the fact that you break the divide between international and national migrants, because indeed seen from the periphery very often they're both aliens. We have quite a few questions, but I would, if you'd like to address my question, please do so, but you don't have to actually, because I'm sure the audience has more interesting questions. It's up to you, Tim. I let you be the judge of that.
Just briefly, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that the idea of a constellation is supposed to be looser than a structure, so it isn't always easily definable. I mean, it comes from Walter Benjamin, the idea that you can see stars at night and it might look like a shape even if it isn't a shape. And so I like that kind of idea. But the constellation of mobility that is dominant now is automobility, right? It's this idea that we have a car-centered culture. So what does that mean? It means that the movements, meanings, and practices of mobility, for most of us, have been centered on the automobile, both the infrastructures we live in, the cities we live in, the ways we get to and from work, the ways we get to and from leisure, the idea of the car as something that brings with it prestige, freedom, and all of these things. And so what are the future possibilities there? What are emergent things? Well, we have a sharing economy. We're talking about car clubs and such like companies. I think like BMW and Volkswagen are now advertising themselves as selling mobility, not selling cars. And because it's seen as a service rather than it's something that they have to change to deal with. And so they are trying desperately to still make cars, but call it something else to change the meaning of it. And we can think about different ways that might go in the future. One is towards the driverless car shared mobility model, which doesn't get out of automobility. It has that old, if you like, structure stuck in it. So you'll still have streets full of cars everywhere, just empty ones a lot of the time, because people will send their car home when they go to the restaurant. So it's even worse potentially in terms of crowding. And then you have the kind of other side of it, which is, say, the cycling culture, the idea of active culture, of active mobility, of walking and cycling, where you're actually taking something from what you might call a residual constellation. These aren't new technologies, these are old technologies, and trying to put them into the emergent one by saying, this is the way we should go. In places like China, this has become important because they had a cycling culture that was enormous. It was destroyed by an automobility constellation, And now the government's saying they'll ride bikes again and starting to do bike lanes because that part of their culture was something that would help them with constant levels of smog and pollution and carbon emissions and things like that. So that's just a nod to the way that works.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed. Thinking about meanings, I never thought of mobility in those terms, but I don't have a driving license and I used to be a loser, but now I'm such a cool guy and it's great. So I have the order for the questions. We first Yvonne, and then Stefan Schlegel, then Gianni D'Amato, and then Matteo Gianni, right? And we may have more, please, in the chat or elsewhere. So please, Yvonne, go ahead. Your mic is off. Yvonne, your mic is off.
Yes, now, okay. Thanks a lot, both of you, for these fascinating elements. I wanted to reflect a bit more on the spatial implications of the movement of people, and particularly the cities that has been very strongly brought by Nikola. And I think it's a topic that sooner or later, all of us are going to be dealing with. So Nikola speaks about the decline of the attractivity of cities, which to me, it's interesting to contrast with something that has been happening in the past 2 decades with the so-called cultural economy, where governments have been trying to valorize downtown and the center of the cities to make them centers of interest for tourists and for highly skilled migrants, which has led to an increased interest in the centers of cities and to population in a way of many cities, which is very nicely exemplified, for example, for the case of Barcelona, which has led to a lot of gentrification and popular protests resisting that gentrification and efforts to improve centers that were formerly run down but are now being improved. So to me, this trend, and what I wonder now is what's going to happen to this trend with the new attractivity of the suburbs. Are we seeing a phenomenon like we saw in the 1970s to the 1990s of reinforced urban sprawl? At the same time, what's the implications for planning and the environment? Like all planning efforts around the world are reinforcing density in the center of the cities for purposes of environment, of less car mobility. But if with COVID, the trend is again towards suburbanization, is this kind of undermining the efforts of planning and environmental protection to densify cities? And finally, in terms of social protest, can we say that social protest that was highly concentrated in urban centers could possibly start moving to smaller cities or to more suburban areas? So since both of you are geographers, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Are there any efforts going on at the moment thinking about these possible implications of displacement of movements of people and spatial implications? And how can we quantify it and think about it? So that would be basically my reflection on that.
I think that's primarily a Nikola question.
Yes, it's probably better if one of you answers, because we have quite a few questions and we want to give the word to everyone. So Nikola, would you, about the city again?
Yes, sure. A very important point that you raised there, Yvonne, and something that we've started to think about and that we've actually started to team up now with remote sensing experts to try and get into this urban sprawl phenomenon that might be evolving now. I think it comes down to also a challenge for planners, what you said, because the one side is now the movement out of the cities that might cause urban sprawl. But in Germany and other countries, we've also seen in the 1990s and 1980s that the so-called baby boomer generation has moved to the hinterlands. And I remember 10 years ago or so, it was huge scientific discussions and people calling that the baby boomer generation will have no real pension income because they've put everything into buying a house in the hinterland, and now they won't be able to sell it at a good price because there's no need for it because everyone wants to live in the cities. And suddenly this is now changing again. Suddenly there's now again a market here for the baby boomers to sell their homes. So for them, that might be a very positive thing. And for planners, that will be the challenge to actually try and now guide people who move to the hinterland to use already existing buildings and not build completely new areas that are previously unexplored, to create more sort of use and to sort of free up or not use any more green space for the new trend that we've seen here now. And at the other side of the spectrum, we have the challenge for planners to try and guide through this change that we're now seeing with office spaces being vacant if they're not used again. The question is then, can they be actually transformed into affordable housing? And I think that's the key challenge here. If we find ways to create affordable green housing, there are ways now urban spaces can actually be relatively green. Urban green housing is possible. So if we find ways to create more affordable green housing in the cities, I think this is a very effective means of ensuring that the city is remaining the place that it's been sort of on the way of developing in the last years, to actually continue that trend. Because part of this movement out of the city is really caused by housing prices. And if now this change of home office will create possibly more affordable housing in the cities, that might also address that change. I hope this sort of touches on the issues that you've raised, but certainly a topic I also agree that it will stay with us in the coming years.
Thank you very much. It's rather optimistic. I mean, I hope it will happen. Basically, cities will have to innovate and will have to improve in order to be still able to get populations, right? They would have to reinvent themselves. Sounds good. I live in Neuchâtel. Stefan Schlegel also had a question.
Thanks for this intriguing conversation. I was very interested in a concept that Tim Cresswell briefly touched upon, and I was wondering whether you could unfold this a bit, at this idea of a mobility commons, if I got you right. If you could explain us a bit more on that, and what in your conception is sort of the underlying commonly used resource, and who is part of the pool of the resource users, and how a tragedy of the commons would be avoided without restricting the pool of the users.
Oh, they're great questions. I think that the mobility commons idea, or commoning mobilities, comes from well, I mean, Mimi Scheller has been working on it, but also we at the group that written this book, and particularly Anna Nikola in Amsterdam, have been trying to think about what commoning mobility might mean. And it's derived from, at least immediately, it's derived from ideas of the urban commons and the right to the city from Henri Lefebvre, of people having a right to public space. But what we, well, given my tendencies to look backwards and think about poetry, I was thinking about the commons, the actual closure of the commons, or the enclosure of the commons in British history, where the commons were a piece of land that people, one of the things that characterized them was that people could move across them. And one of the things that characterized enclosure was their fencing in or walling in. So that a poet like John Clare, who's one of my favorite sort of older poets, sort of basically driven crazy by this new landscape that emerged around him, as the land he once could walk across is now closed to him. So part of it's about the resources you can have, and part of it's about where you're allowed to go in a particular kind of way, and who has the ability to go there. So translated into a modern version of it, the idea of the mobility commons basically, I mean, there's two main points to it. One is to decouple mobility from the way it's predominantly talked about in government planning circles and in economics, which is one as a kind of individual freedom. Mobility has been enshrined as a right in one form or another across Western democracies. You know, predominantly it's like the #1 right in the European Union. It's like the first thing is the right to move. And it's also been completely tied to the idea of economic growth, that you measure mobility to measure growth. One of the things that happened early on in COVID here was that there's been a measure for a long time of traffic, just simply cars and stuff on the road. And the higher that measure used to be attached to the more successful the economy. And they immediately had to switch that to making that measure a measure of people breaking lockdown or the spread of the disease. So the meaning of the traffic changed from a successful economy to a negative very quickly in terms of exactly the same measure that the government does on a regular basis. And so decoupling mobility from both individual rights and from economic growth, and then coupling it to shared access, where one person's mobility and or immobility is always thought about in relation to other people's mobility and or immobility. So unlike the commons in the literal sense, it isn't a resource that is finite, really. I mean, I guess there is a finite amount of mobility, but it's way beyond what we actually do. So it's more about connecting or thinking about that resource outside of the individual and connecting it across people and across social groups. So when we're talking about roads, or talking about the provision of public transport, or talking about bicycle lanes, these are all complicated, and not to think about it to think about it in relation to what is the externalities of driving a car for other people, right? Who gets hurt? What does it mean? It actually means that you're less able to walk and less able to cycle. It's not a zero-sum game, but it's close to it. One thing increases, the other decreases. So you have to start thinking about those things together, rather than it's a right to move, and it's a sign of success to move, and think of it more in a socialized sense, and more as mobility in the way I've talked about it, and less as just pure movement, as a kind of a technocratic thing that you can solve technocratically. Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you. Gianni, it's your turn.
Yes, thanks to both of you for this really intriguing conversation you have led. I would like to question some of your assumptions. I would like to see how you would respond to it. And basically, I start from the fact that we are now confronted with a crisis, and Tim referred to them. Basically, it's not only the pandemic, but it's also the climate change problem which we are confronted with. If we follow this, obviously, if we take it as a crisis, then usually we have to find responses quite soon and quite convincing how to react. And Tim basically referred to the different algorithmical changes which we have been confronted. And the question and Nikola was basically also referring to the shrinking cities, to a sort of new, maybe not so new development. We are confronted in certain cities, but not in all, because there are also growing cities in several parts of continental Europe, and also obviously in UK, if I think at London. So the question is, how sustainable are your assessments you are offering today here? Since our societies are not China, we are confronted with incredible resilience towards all the measures which have been taken with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, and people protesting everywhere that they have enough of this limitations of their individual liberties. And for that reason, the question is, will we have more of the same, more of what we had before, more of the segmentation, which we experienced already since all the different other economic crises were confronted with in the 70s? And to which extent can we really go for home offices? I mean, we are now forced to have this conference behind a laptop screen. And this is obviously feasible to a limited extent. Maybe such technocratic, I don't think this is one, but basically coordination meetings are quite well to be done with a laptop on Zoom or on WebEx. But if we have to be creative, if we have to cooperate to one another, then obviously what Jean-Thomas said before, it's much more interesting and much more productive to be together. So come back to the question, how sustainable is the view you are offering today to us?
Well, I'll have a go at starting here. I mean, I'm not sure I offered a view that can be measured in terms of sustainability, because it was more of a looking at what's happened with COVID to think about the future. And so I guess if I was just to say what's happened in relation to COVID, the original signs were very good. You know, the original signs of, well, I mean, if you reduce air travel by 90% immediately, that in a brute obvious way is a massive reduction in the fastest growing source of carbon emissions in the transport sector, which is aviation. If you say you know that all of those of you who can work from home, you do get rid of a huge amount of the automobile traffic in cities, partly because people who are poorer might not have automobiles, might not have cars anyway, and they use public transport all the time, particularly in the US. So the public transport can continue, but you know, people who usually drive cars are decrease very quickly. Places like Milan and other cities around the world, really, in India as well. I mean, suddenly got bicycle lanes that people have been fighting for decades suddenly were provided overnight. It happened here. In Edinburgh, there was a plan called Spaces for People, which happened because of COVID. Now, there's all kinds of resistance to it. Shop owners resist it. Car drivers want to get back in their cars. Cars are seen as safe spaces now because it seems safer than a bus because you don't have to share any space with anyone. Although there's almost no evidence that sharing public transport has led to any major outbreaks of COVID. So you know, there are contradictory signals as to how the COVID situation is going to lead in relation to climate change. You know, airlines have got rid of airplanes permanently. This is already happening thanks to flight shaming and Greta. And you know, the Swiss, SAS had to reduce its stock of planes because fewer Swiss people were flying, and they had to increase the train service just because of the amount of shame she put on people for taking airplanes. I guess one of my worries is that, I mean, my main worry is that once people think of this as a normal disease, then capitalism is very good at reproducing itself, and either it will continue as normal, or it will repackage profit making in a particular way, like the car companies are selling mobility instead of cars, but that doesn't actually get rid of the cars. The cars will stay in one way or another. My main feeling is that things will get back to something like they used to look very quickly. But I think there more optimistically, there are more people who have had to think about this and about their relationships to other people because they've been news stories and they've been on family walks more frequently and things like that. They've got out in nature. Nature has become something that people go to feel better about COVID, to be amongst the trees in the woods. So, you know, I'm a skeptic in that I believe the the forces of capital are very powerful, and they haven't seen quite yet the way to not be polluting the world. But there's a little bit of hope in there as well.
Thank you, team. We now have a question from Matteo Gianni, and then no further questions. Actually, I urge you, all of you, to sign up in the queue.
I don't know if Nicola wanted to answer to Gianni's question, I think. So please, Nicola, go.
Because I thought we were, yeah, okay. Nicola?
Thank you. Yeah, now we took turns we took turns with the previous question, so I was also happy just for Tim to go. But I sort of thought I had some ideas on answering to Jenny's question, because I think it's really relevant.
Of course.
And I kind of thought of it as a question as how trends in international and internal migration and mobility that we've seen in the last years and even decades, how resilient they might be to COVID, to put it in a slightly different perspective. And I would argue that a lot of trends might actually turn out to be quite resilient. Most of the drivers of international migration are probably continuing once COVID is over to be in effect again. So construction labor will be needed, service labor will be needed in places where there might not be enough domestic workforce. So this will probably continue to induce migration. We'll have students and skilled labor that will continue to like to move and have international experience. So this is likely to continue. And we'll have wars and political conflict and other things that cause refugees to move to other countries and seek refuge elsewhere. This is also likely to continue. So we'll probably continue to see these flows. Whether the climate crisis itself will induce migration that is going across borders is yet another hotly debated question that we'll see what happens. But something that will certainly be not resilient, I think, to COVID in that degree is business travel. So the shorter term mobility, probably even seasonal mobility. But certainly the business travel, I think, will go down, not so much hopefully for scientific conferences, because I also like the personal engagement there, but I think some meetings of people that already know each other from different parts of the world will certainly turn online now at increasing rates. So I think we'll see quite some changes in the mobility field that I sort of distinguish from migration through the temporal aspects of mobility being something that is for a number of days or weeks or a couple of months, but not really longer than a year, where you don't really change your place of residence. So this will certainly change a lot more, I think, than international and internal migration.
Thank you, Nicola. It's very interesting to hear that, according to you, and you're the expert, that the fundamental drivers of international migration will pretty much resume to where they were. I will, Matteo Gianni, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My question has already been asked by others, but I just want a clarification from Tim. It's possible because, like Stefan, I'm very much interested in this idea of mobility justice. And I would like to know a little bit more about the status that you give to the concept of justice. In the sense, is justice intended in terms of Weberian understanding, the way people consider a mobility regime as being just for them, or you go a little bit further in terms of normative assessment about what a just mobility is, and therefore what kind of unjust mobility we should fight against. If this is the case, what will be the general framework you are in? Because you mentioned Mimi Scheller, I see a kind of argument in terms of capabilities, drawing mostly on Amartya Sen approach. Would you imagine other ways to start to structure a little bit a normative thinking about the justice of mobility?
Oh, I mean, that's a very profound question, and I'm really completely indebted to Mimi's work here, and so I'm kind of the wrong person to have here to talk about it, because I mean, I would just read her book, and you know, she has a very complicated and sophisticated set of layers of of ways in which justice works in relation to mobility, including procedural justice, like including people in decision making about mobility, as well as what actually happens when people move and how they move. And I think, you know, if I was to sort of throw something in, I think I would, I think it was it Rawls? I think it was Rawls. It may have been, I think it was Rawls who said that, you know, to imagine yourself as being born randomly into a world, and what would the world you would want to be born into. And so the idea is, if we're born now, we, you know, whatever percentage of us could be in poverty, you know, on the edge of starvation, you know, likely to be a migrant, forced migrant of some kind, whereas, you know, a very small percentage of us are in the 1% or the 10% or whatever. So would we choose to be randomly born into this world that we live in, or would there be some other arrangement of things that we'd prefer to be born into? And I think it kind of works a little bit with mobility too. It's like, if you imagine, you know, in terms of mobility and what you have access to and don't have access to in terms of moving, what world would you want to be born into if it was random, if you knew you'd be born into it randomly? And I don't think it's this one. And I think that's because we need to think about the relationship between, well, actually a number of different things, which I am more on solid ground with, which is, you know, why you move, what stops you from moving, what speed you can move at, how often you move, what routes, what directions you take, things such as that, and how that aligns you on a kind of continuum of, the way I like to think of it is between the citizen as a kind of ideal of a mobile subject, who can access the things that the citizen needs to access at will, ideally, and the vagabonds, the person who has to move because when they don't want to, the person that is displaced from the place they'd rather be in, the person that is treated with contempt when they move and then in places they move through. And I think that these aspects of mobility, or politics of mobility, align you in this kind of continuum of ideal types between the citizen and the vagabond. And, you know, and they're related to each other. As Bauman said in relation to the tourist and the vagabond in a slightly different argument, you need the vagabonds to service the tourist. The tourist mobility is based on the metaphorical vagabonds who service tourism. So so they're related to each other, and you've got to think about those relations and equalize them in terms of desire and will and comfort and speed and all of these other things. Again, I would, you know, I would write a note to Mimi for a more considered argument about theories of justice, but that's the way I think about it.
Thank you very much, Tim. Nicola, would you like to venture into a normative argument?
I don't know, this is not my home turf, I would say. I mean, this sort of idea of being, you know, born, which world would you be born in if it was just randomly, is an intriguing concept that, of course, obviously relates to the whole argument about who's privileged and who's not, and because of what. Is it the passport? Nowadays, it could be the vaccine statement. So this is probably interesting about COVID, that certainly the passport is the #1 privilege that we once had as, you know, Westerners, is now not the #1, but maybe the #2. And the vaccine statement is the #1. But again, we show that the countries that we live in, and Switzerland, Germany, Europe, is among the first to be, you know, fully vaccinated, and other parts of the world are not. So maybe there's even more disadvantage now than would be based on passports. I don't know, I'm not the expert, I'm just sort of developing this argument now as we go, but it's certainly something interesting that one could explore.
Yes, it's called The Veil of Ignorance by John Rawls, and you are right. If we apply to our own situation, I got my second shot yesterday, and I'm not sure that I would devise in the ignorance behind the veil, the system as it is. I was wondering, do we have more questions? It's set, actually it's 5:23, so we can leave it there. I feel a bit sorry that
Kirsten does.
Sorry about that. I don't see, because I don't see it on the. Oh, sorry, Kirsten Martel.
Yes, thank you. Very quick questions. Thank you very much for these inspiring talks and also inspiring questions. And from the perspective of an early career scholar, I'm wondering, so I basically have two questions. One is how to get through these very much entangled public discourses, media discourses, to identify what direction of travel to take, meaning as you all exposed, there are different forces in play, and to identify these forces as either being forces for good or in terms of climate protection and so on, or forces, capitalist forces, for example, and others, I think is one major challenge that we have as researchers. How would you go about that? And also, then leading to the second question, the societal forces on a really like micro-sociological level that are currently emerging. How can we address those, for example, with also small n studies and thick descriptions to identify what's going on a societal level, because these societal forces are maybe something that is quite relevant also when deciding what direction are we going to move. And I'm just thinking, for example, about all these people who have translocational relationships across the globe, and even if they're not traveling physically, there is this imaginary mobility, and these are established links amongst diasporas and migrants and whomever. So I'm wondering how you would see this also from a methodological perspective.
Well, I mean, I'll start. I think maybe the last part of that is again more of a Nikola question, possibly. But I think you know, I think it's very complicated. I mean, I do take a normative, to answer the previous question, I do take a normative view of justice, and so so I'm interested in what's right and what's wrong. But it is complicated because in terms of an individual act of mobility, it's not, you know, it's not clear. It depends on who you're talking about. You might think of it as a sort of intersectional mobility thing, right? Like thinking about gender and ethnicity and class and national origin and all of these things in relation to how justice works out, or what's good and what's bad. So you can't easily say, you know, there's one thing that's always good and one thing that's always bad, and it's very situational. You know, for instance, I mean, let's give you an example. The Dutch designer who does open space design for traffic systems, I forget his name. So basically the idea is you get rid of all signs, make it a level surface, and the only way people interact as pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers is by socially communicating with each other. In other words, eye contact, basically. And you know, it seems like a good idea, and it's been well used in certain cities in the Netherlands and even in London. There's some parts of London that have done that, but it immediately became clear that it didn't work well for disabled people, either people who couldn't see, so couldn't engage in that way, or the flat surfaces that is part of it. They don't have a way of knowing where the edge of the road is, or whether they're in traffic or not in traffic. And so there's a negative outcome that was could have been predictable, but wasn't predicted. Similarly with big things like using light rail as a system to travel into the city that is green, which is actually green. I mean, it is. It uses less carbon than driving, and it uses less carbon than taking the bus even. Trains are a very good way of traveling. But if the light rail money is being paid to develop light rail that is taken out of a bus system, and the bus system stops at regular intervals along a street, you suddenly have all these parts of the city that no longer have a stop. It's faster and greener, but it's also disconnected people in the process. So every time we do this sort of analysis of where people are moving and how they're moving, we have to think about all those implications to sort of weigh up the justice of it, rather than assuming it to begin with, even though it seems like it. In terms of the more migration related questions, I'm going to hang that over to Nikola.
Yeah, I might just quickly touch on the methodology problem or issue that you raised. And what comes here to my mind is how survey methodology has changed recently. When we think about the transition from face-to-face interviewing, for asking about, motives for moving, reasons for moving, transnational constructs, family arrangements that arise. This is often captured through surveys. And there's now this transition from face-to-face to online, where we have much less of an idea of selection effects, of biases that might be present at the site where the individual actually looks at the phone and answers the questions. And this whole question that you touched on about social media, other media, sort of attitudes that are now present, societal developments, I think we need to pay more attention to how this actually affects how answers to surveys that are posited online are made and how they might be affected.
Well, thank you so much. It's now 5:30, and we like to finish on time usually here. But perhaps I leave both of you the last word. Perhaps if you could say one very strong idea, in few words. And I will say one myself. Actually, I'm not even. I thought it was very interesting, Tim, what you said about in the UK, where going out of the lockdown meant going to bars, basically. And it's an argument that was the same thing in France. It seems that the whole, perspective of going out has been reduced to hanging out on a terrace with our mates and drinking, which is indeed very important. And don't get me wrong. I mean, we all like the occasional drink, but we like to think that there is more looking into the future in the post-lockdown world than having a drink. And François Sureau was a French intellectual somehow said that this was the spritz ideology. And I have the feeling that Nicolas said earlier that the structural determinants are still there, but then there is, of course, politics, and we need, to sort of envisage a collective future. And the spritz ideology is probably not the way to go forward. So that's my conclusion, and I let you, both of you.
Well, I would say that hopefully in the future we'll have more intriguing discussions like this, which I found very, very interesting and inspiring. And I would hope that then actually we'll have this in presence in Neuchâtel somewhere. I envision this as a beautiful place, and be together to have a beer afterwards together without having the fear of falling ill with COVID because of it. So that's my vision of the near future.
I think I can reasonably promise you that you will have a spritz apéro someday here in Neuchâtel with us, because it's been a wonderful input. Thank you so much.
So I love that vision, and I can assure Nicola that it is a beautiful place. As I recall it when I was there for 6 months, most of you who worked there live somewhere else. So maybe now, given what we've heard from Nicola, people are moving back to Neuchâtel to be away from the big city of Zurich or Geneva. I think one thing I'd like to raise, I didn't really raise, and I think is important, and it links to that idea that, we want to see each other, right? I think when John Urry was writing about mobility early on, he said people imagined that virtual mobility like we're having now would replace face-to-face mobility or corporeal mobility. And in fact, what happens is it increases it in normal times, is the more people are in communication, the more they want to actually go to where the person they're communicating is with. So meetings have actually multiplied, not decreased, because of things like this. And every time I've done something like this over the last year, there's been this, we will meet in this place that we're talking, Zurich was the last one, I think, Neuchâtel, hopefully I'm coming. We want to do that. And I think it's important to bear it amongst all of this theorizing, or including in the theorizing, is that mobility is a central meaning given thing to human life. Like we are a culture, our poetry, our music, our films, the epic poems were journeys, the first novels were novels of travel. Travel and the journey is important to who we are culturally, and we can't negate that in the ways we think about these things instrumentally. And I think that's fundamental.